I've never been the kind of person to scare easily. I grew up listening to horror stories, but I always thought those things happened to other people, never to me. That was before that night. I had left work late and was driving down the highway to visit my parents in a small town. It was around 1 a.m, and the road was practically deserted. The streetlights were far apart, and the radio only picked up static. The only company I had was the hum of the engine and the dim glow of the dashboard. I had been driving for almost 2 hours, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, when it happened for the first time. In the rearview mirror, something moved in the back seat. It was a quick motion, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a chill down my spine. My heart pounded, and I forced myself to look again. Nothing, just the dark, empty seat. I took a deep breath and let out a nervous laugh. "You're just tired, that's all," I muttered to myself, trying to shake it off. But then it happened again. This time, I saw it clearly. A figure, a man, sitting there, still as a statue, like he had been there all along. Panic surged through me. My hands were slick with sweat, and my chest tightened with a raw, primal fear. My body reacted before my mind could process. I jerked the car onto the shoulder, slamming the brakes. The tires screeched, and I felt the car skid slightly before coming to a halt. My heart was hammering so loudly it echoed inside the car. I turned, eyes wide, expecting... what? A stranger sitting there staring at me? But there was nothing. The back seat was empty, just like before. I sat there for a while, breathing heavily, trying to steady myself. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, maybe my own reflection playing tricks on me. I shook my head, turned on the hazard lights, and rubbed my hands over my face. "You're scaring yourself over nothing," I whispered. And then, against every instinct screaming inside me, I put the car back in gear and merged onto the road again, ignoring the persistent shiver crawling down my spine and the overwhelming sense that I was no longer alone. I kept driving, trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me, but something felt wrong. The silence inside the car felt heavier, denser. The engine kept humming steadily, but I had the overwhelming sense that there was someone else in the car with me. Every minute that passed, my grip on the steering wheel tightened. Then, something shifted in the rearview mirror again. This time, it wasn't a sudden movement. It was subtle, like the darkness in the back seat was expanding. My stomach twisted, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. What happened next is hard to explain. A strange smell started filling the car, something damp and sweet, like wet earth mixed with an old perfume. My eyes watered, and the air felt heavier, pressing down on me. Then I heard it. Not a loud noise, not even something clear. Just a whisper. Low, drawn out, like someone was breathing words into my ear, but I couldn't understand them. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't want to look, but I did, and that's when I saw him. The figure was clearer now. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a man, pale with blurred features, sitting in the middle of the back seat, staring at me through the mirror. But the worst part wasn't seeing him. The worst part was realizing that he was smiling. Not a normal smile. It was too wide, like the skin on his face had been stretched beyond its limit. My eyes went wide and my chest grew heavy, like something was pressing down on me. My body locked up, my hands frozen on the wheel. The only thing I could do was slam my foot down on the gas, as if speeding up could somehow save me from whatever was in my car. The engine roared as I floored the pedal, the numbers on the speedometer climbing fast. The road stretched endlessly in front of me, but I barely saw anything beyond the blur of asphalt passing beneath my tires. I refused to look again. I knew that if I did, he would still be there. Maybe closer, maybe right behind me. I forced myself to focus on the road, my breaths coming fast and shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then he spoke. Just one word, rough and drawn out, whispered right behind my ear. "Stop." That was enough to make me lose control for a second. My hands were shaking so badly that the car veered slightly to the right, almost going off the road. I gripped the wheel tightly, trying to steady the car, but my mind was screaming at me not to stop. It didn't matter what that thing wanted. I knew, in some deep, irrational, instinctive way, that stopping meant something far worse. I kept my foot on the gas, pressing down harder, even as my eyes burned from trying not to blink. I couldn't blink. I couldn't look back. Then, the temperature inside the car plummeted. My fingers started to ache from the cold, and my breath came out in small white puffs. It didn't make sense. Outside, it was a warm summer night, yet inside the car, the air was freezing, seeping into my bones. My stomach twisted with the realization that something was fundamentally wrong, like the rules of reality were bending around that thing. And then I felt it. Hands, cold, dry, with fingers that were too long, sliding slowly over the back of my neck. That was enough to make me scream. A raw, desperate sound ripped from my throat, and I yanked the steering wheel to the side, sending the car skidding onto the shoulder. The rear tires screeched, and the car spun before coming to a sudden stop in the middle of the road. My eyes were wide, my chest heaving. Silence. Absolute silence. There was nothing anymore. No smell, no sound, no presence. Just my car sitting still on the asphalt and my frantic breathing, like it had never been there at all. I sat there completely frozen until I saw headlights approaching in the distance. An old pickup truck slowed down beside me, and a man rolled down his window, looking at me with concern. "Are you okay, miss?" My mouth was dry. I forced myself to take a deep breath before nodding hesitantly. "I saw your car spin out. Need some help?" I shook my head, blinking a few times. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. I couldn't explain what had happened, but one thing I knew for sure: I would never drive that highway at night again, ever. This happened about 5 years ago, but I still think about it almost every week. I never really believed in those strange stories you hear about, but after that night, well, I don't know what to believe anymore. Back then, I worked as a truck driver, crossing the country from one end to the other. It was a lonely job, but I liked the freedom of driving for hours without anyone bothering me. That night, I was in the middle of a long trip, heading from Texas to Colorado. I stopped at a gas station in the middle of nowhere, one of those places that feels abandoned at night, with flickering lights and an eerie silence in the air. The cold was biting, and all I wanted was a cup of coffee before hitting the road again. As I was fueling up, I noticed a kid standing near the entrance of the station. He looked about 8 or 9, wearing a jacket that was way too thin for the freezing weather. He was just standing there, staring into the distance. It was odd, but I figured he was waiting for his parents to come out of the bathroom or something. When I finished fueling up, I went inside the convenience store to grab my coffee. The cashier was an older woman with tired eyes, chewing gum like she couldn't care less about anything. "Hey, is that kid outside waiting for someone?" I asked, nodding toward the entrance. She frowned, confused. "What kid?" I chuckled, thinking she hadn't noticed. "The one in the blue jacket. He's right outside, just standing there." She glanced toward the window, then back at me with a shrug. "Ain't nobody out there, sir." I turned immediately to look through the glass, expecting to see the boy. But he was gone. I swallowed hard, but I tried not to think too much about it. Maybe the kid had run off while I was inside, or maybe I was just seeing things. The long drive was starting to mess with my head, that's all. I grabbed my coffee, paid, and headed back to my truck. The parking lot was almost empty, dimly lit by a few flickering lamps. The wet pavement reflected the lights from the store, making everything look distorted. I climbed into the cab, shut the door, and exhaled, shaking off the weird feeling creeping up my spine. I turned on the engine and pulled out onto the highway. It didn't take long for that strange feeling to return. You know that sensation you get when you realize someone's watching you? That prickling awareness, like eyes boring into your back? I felt it, but I was alone. The only sounds were the rumbling of the engine and the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt. Even so, something felt wrong. I glanced up at my rearview mirror, not knowing what I was expecting to see. And that's when my stomach dropped. The boy was there, standing on the side of the road, right on the shoulder, staring directly at my truck as I passed. He wasn't trying to wave me down, wasn't crying, wasn't moving. Just standing there, perfectly still, watching me with dark, unblinking eyes. My heart pounded, and for a split second, I thought about slamming on the brakes. But instinct took over. I pressed harder on the gas. I tried convincing myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was another kid, someone who just looked like him. But deep down, I knew better. That image burned itself into my brain. The same thin jacket, the same blank expression, the same motionless stare. I kept driving, gripping the wheel tightly, forcing myself to focus on the road. My chest felt tight, and every shadow along the highway seemed to shift unnaturally. After about 30 minutes, I finally started to calm down. I turned on the radio to drown out the suffocating silence in the cab, trying to think about anything else. That's when I glanced at my side mirror and nearly lost control of the truck. The boy was there again. This time he was standing by an abandoned bus stop on the side of the road, just as still as before. But now, something was different. His head was tilted slightly to one side, like he was curious, or like he recognized me. There was no way he could have gotten there that fast. I hadn't seen any passing cars, no houses, no side roads where he could have hitched a ride. He was just there, waiting. My breathing turned shallow. I pressed the accelerator harder, trying to shake off the absurd thought that he was following me. My hands felt slick with sweat on the wheel. I just wanted to get the hell out of there, find a place with people, lights, noise, anything that would make me feel normal again. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over yet. I kept driving, refusing to look at the mirrors again. I didn't want to see anything else. My only goal was to reach the next town, find a place that felt real, that wasn't consumed by whatever nightmare I had stumbled into. But the silence inside the cab grew heavier, and that awful feeling of not being alone crawled back into my skin. I forced myself to take deep breaths, my fingers gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. Just a few more miles, and this will be over, I told myself. That's when I felt the weight shift in the back seat. I didn't hear the door open. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't feel the cold wind rush in. I just felt that I wasn't alone anymore. The air turned ice cold, like someone had opened a freezer right behind me. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. From the corner of my eye, I could see a dark shape in the back, perfectly still. I didn't want to look. I knew exactly who it was. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to turn around, to just keep driving as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't help myself. I looked in the rearview mirror. The boy was sitting in the back seat, staring at me through the mirror. The same blank, lifeless expression. But this time, he was smiling. I slammed on the brakes, my truck skidding across the empty road. When I turned around, the back seat was empty. No blue jacket, no kid, no one. Just the low rumble of the engine breaking the eerie silence. I sat there, frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. After a few minutes, I forced myself to keep driving. I never told anyone about this before. But even now, whenever I'm on the road at night and something moves in my rearview mirror, I never, ever look. I've always preferred driving at night. Less traffic, fewer distractions, just me, the road, and the playlist I put together to stay awake. This happened a few months ago when I was driving back home from visiting my family. It was late, probably past 2 in the morning, and I had been on the road for hours without stopping. My gas tank was running low, and my stomach was growling, so I decided to pull into the first gas station I could find. It was one of those rural gas stations in the middle of nowhere, lit only by a few flickering fluorescent lights. The place was practically empty, except for the half-asleep cashier behind the counter and some guy fueling up his old truck across the lot. I walked into the convenience store to grab an energy drink and something to eat. The air smelled like stale coffee and cleaning products, mixed with that odd, artificial cold that these places always have late at night. As I picked up a bag of chips and made my way to the register, I noticed a girl standing at the back of the store. She looked about 12 or 13, wearing an oversized blue hoodie and denim shorts. There was something off about her. She was fidgeting, biting her lip, glancing around like she was waiting for someone. But she didn't seem to be with anyone, and at that hour, it felt wrong. I paid for my stuff, trying not to make it obvious, but I kept watching her through the reflection of the refrigerator glass. That's when a man appeared from the next aisle over. He wore dirty work clothes, stained with grease and dust. He didn't hesitate, didn't look around. He just grabbed the girl by the wrist and pulled her toward the door. She resisted for a split second, but he tightened his grip, mumbling something I couldn't hear. The way she looked at him, like she wanted to scream but was too afraid, sent a shiver down my spine. No one else in the store seemed to notice. The cashier was still half asleep, and the other customer had already left. I could have just walked away. It wasn't my problem. Maybe he was her father or an uncle, and I was overreacting. But something in my gut screamed that this wasn't right. I stepped outside and saw them crossing the parking lot. The man opened the door of a dark car and shoved her inside. When he got into the driver's seat, she turned her head and looked out the window, and at that moment, seeing her expression, wide eyes, pale face, I knew. She didn't want to be there. My throat went dry. I felt frozen for a second, trying to decide what to do. Call the police? But what would I even say? Hey, I just saw a girl get into a car with a guy who seemed suspicious? They'd ask me if I was sure she was being taken against her will, and I wasn't. But my instinct screamed that something was off. So before I could overthink it, I got into my car and started the engine. Their car was already pulling out of the gas station, headlights cutting through the empty road. I took a deep breath and followed them. I kept a safe distance, not wanting to make it obvious. I'm no detective, but I've seen enough movies to know that if you get too close, people notice. Their car took a side road, one of those narrow highways cutting through empty fields and overgrown lots. No streetlights, nothing but the glow of their taillights ahead of me. As I drove, I kept trying to figure out what to do. Should I call the police now? And say what? But if I waited too long, something could happen to that girl. Then, something strange happened. The car ahead slowed down, and my pulse spiked. It didn't stop completely, but it was moving way too slow, like the driver knew he was being followed. Had I been too obvious? I forced myself to look at the road, to act normal, but my mind was already racing with possibilities. If he knew, he might turn around and confront me, or worse. And that's exactly what happened. The car in front of me suddenly slammed on the brakes in the middle of the deserted road. My heart jumped, and I had to hit my brakes hard to avoid crashing into the back of it. I sat there, hands sweating against the wheel. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The car didn't move. No doors opened. We just sat there, in the dark, my headlights illuminating the dry grass on the roadside. And then, slowly, the driver's side door creaked open. My breathing grew shallow. The man stepped out of the car slowly, like he knew exactly what he was doing, like he was testing my reaction. The dim interior light flickered on for a second before he shut the door. Hollow eyes, unshaven face, an expression devoid of anything human. He just stood there, in the middle of the road, his back to me, like he was waiting for me to make the first move. My hands were slick on the steering wheel, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to see me without fully turning around. And that's when I saw the girl. In the rear window, she was staring back at me, her eyes wide, her lips slightly parted. The weak glow from the dashboard lit up her face, and she made the smallest movement with her head, a subtle shake, side to side. No. A silent plea for me not to get out of my car. My stomach twisted. I didn't know what to do. If I drove away, I might be leaving her to a terrible fate. But if I tried anything, this man could be armed. Or worse, there could be someone else in the car, waiting for the right moment to act. The man started walking toward me. Slow, deliberate steps, like he knew that each second of silence made my fear worse. My mind raced through every possibility. He could confront me, drag me out of my car, follow me if I tried to escape. I had to act fast. Before he could get too close, I did the only thing I could think of. I flicked my headlights on full beam. The dark road exploded into blinding white light, illuminating every detail of his face. He raised a hand to his eyes, taking a step back. I seized that moment of hesitation and threw my car into reverse. My tires screeched against the rough asphalt as I spun the car around in a sudden, desperate move. Before speeding away, I took one last glance in the mirror. The girl was still there, her hands pressed against the glass like she was trying to say something. The man stood frozen in the road, watching me disappear. I should have gone straight to the police, but fear had taken over. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I drove non-stop for at least 15 minutes, my thoughts spiraling through everything that had just happened. My breathing only steadied when I reached a bigger, well-lit gas station with other cars around. I pulled in, turned off the engine, and tried to collect my thoughts. I couldn't just go home and pretend nothing had happened. My hands were still shaking as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I told them everything, the girl, the man, the empty road. But the dispatcher started asking questions I couldn't answer. What was the car's license plate? What exactly did the girl look like? Which direction were they headed? That was when I realized how unprepared I was. I had acted purely on instinct, but I had no solid information. I gave them what I could, my location, the last place I'd seen the car, but the voice on the other end of the line sounded doubtful. "We'll send a patrol to check the area," they said. But that didn't reassure me. I knew that out there, in the dark, on that forgotten road, a car could disappear like smoke. Days passed, and I became obsessed with finding answers. I searched news reports, checked missing persons lists in the area. Nothing. No girl matching that description. No reports of a kidnapping or anything remotely similar. I started questioning myself. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe she really was with her father, and I had projected my own paranoia onto the situation. But at the same time, deep in my gut, I knew what I had seen. That look in her eyes, the way she silently begged me not to step out of my car. Those images still haunt me. Even now, whenever I'm driving late at night, I can't help but glance at passing cars, scanning the faces in the passenger seats, searching for desperate eyes behind the glass. A part of me knows I'll never truly know what happened that night. But another part, the part that still feels a chill run down my spine when I think of that man standing in the road, knows that I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. And that somewhere out there, that girl might still be waiting for help. I never believed in fate, but that night, it felt like everything had conspired to lead us to that road. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just a weekend getaway to clear our heads. Me and Emma left the cabin later than planned because I insisted on taking a few more pictures of the lake before we headed back. The plan was simple: get on the main highway and be home before midnight. But then the GPS decided to screw us over. One wrong turn, then another, and before we knew it, we were on a narrow road, surrounded by trees on both sides, with no streetlights in sight. The silence on that road felt different. It wasn't just the sound of the engine and the wind against the windows. It was like the world outside had been swallowed by something. No other cars, no houses, nothing. just the dark road and those tall, thick trees that seemed to lean in, closing around us. I was already getting frustrated with the GPS insisting this was the right way when Emma mentioned her phone had died. Mine was already at 1%, not helpful at all. After driving for what felt like forever with no turns or exits, we rounded a sharp curve and came face to face with a roadblock. There were a few faded traffic cones scattered messily and a huge tree branch lying across the road like it had fallen from above. No signs, no workers, just that in the middle of nowhere. My first instinct was to curse under my breath and shift into reverse. But before I could turn the wheel, Emma grabbed my arm. Hard. "There's someone here," she whispered. My stomach dropped. I turned to look at her, and her eyes were locked onto the side mirror, wide with fear. My breath caught in my throat when I looked too. Figures were stepping out of the trees, slowly, deliberately. At least 3 on one side, maybe 2 more on the other. Dark silhouettes, too quiet. No flashlights, no uniforms. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't a road crew. This was an ambush. My body reacted before my mind fully grasped what was happening. My hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers went numb. The air inside the car felt heavier, colder, like the temperature had suddenly dropped. Emma wasn't saying anything, just breathing fast, pressed against the seat. I tried to stay calm, to act like I had everything under control. "It's gonna be fine," I muttered, more for myself than for her. But the truth? I had no idea what to do. Slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves, I shifted into reverse. But before I could hit the gas, one of the men, if they even were men, stepped fully into view. He was tall, unnaturally thin, wearing dark clothes that looked worn out, like they'd been left in the sun for too long. But what really froze me was the way he stared at us. Calm, patient, like he was waiting to see what we would do next. Like he already knew how this was going to end. Behind him, the others kept emerging from the trees, spreading out, moving in complete silence. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of one of them crouching near the edge of the road, doing something on the ground. My heart pounded. Had they slashed our tires? My hands started sweating. We had to get out of there. Without thinking twice, I slammed my foot on the gas, ready to reverse and get the hell out. But the car didn't move. My blood ran cold. I looked at the dashboard, the gear shift, tried again. Nothing. The engine was running, but it was like something was holding us there. "Go! Just go!" Emma shouted, panic in her voice. But it was useless. The car wouldn't budge, and that's when I saw it. The man closest to us smiled. A wide, exaggerated grin that didn't look human. Like he knew, at that moment, we had already lost. My breath caught in my chest. I tried to come up with a logical explanation. Mechanical failure, something stuck under the car, anything. But deep down, I knew none of it made sense. This wasn't a coincidence. They knew this would happen. Emma gripped my arm tighter, her eyes filling with tears. "What do we do?" she whispered, as if speaking any louder would make things worse. But they were already watching us. They had been the whole time. The man with the eerie smile started moving, slowly, dragging his feet across the pavement like he was savoring the moment. The others stayed where they were, completely still, like shadows waiting for the next act of some twisted play. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears that I could barely think. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands, trying to call 911, anyone, no signal. Of course there wasn't. Why would there be? That's when Emma did something I never expected. Before I could react, she lunged forward and slammed her fist onto the door lock button. The sound of the locks clicking shut felt deafening in the quiet night. For a second, nobody moved. The man stopped mid-step, his grin fading. Then, one of the others tapped on the passenger window. It wasn't a knock, not a bang, just a tap, light, testing. I wanted to scream, to floor the gas, to do something, but before I could, Emma grabbed my face with both hands and forced me to look at her. Her eyes were wide, terrified, but there was something else there, determination. desperate but certain. "Do exactly what I say," she whispered. Then she told me something that made me freeze. "Turn the car off and turn it back on." I hesitated. It was a stupid idea. The car was already on, and if it wasn't moving now, shutting it off and turning it back on wouldn't change anything. But Emma was certain, and at that moment, I had no choice but to trust her. With trembling fingers, I turned the key and shut off the engine. The silence inside the car was deafening. The figures outside didn't move, just waited, as if they were curious to see what we would do. I swallowed hard and turned the key again. For one agonizing second, nothing happened. Then the engine roared back to life, and the car moved. Without thinking twice, I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement, and I felt the car lurch forward. This time it responded. This time we could move. The man with the wide smile stepped back, and that's when the others sprang into motion. They lunged toward us. They didn't run like normal people. It was an unnatural movement, like they were being pulled by invisible strings. But it was too late for them. The car shot backward, and I yanked the wheel, spinning the car around and speeding back the way we came. In the mirror, I saw shadows moving fast, but not fast enough. The engine roared, and I pressed my foot down harder, only stopping when we were back on the highway, far away from that road. I could hear Emma crying softly in the seat next to me, and I was shaking so hard I could barely grip the wheel. We never told anyone about it. Who would believe us? What were they? Some group of maniacs? Something worse? I don't know. All I know is that since that night, I've never trusted a GPS again. And every time I see traffic cones on the road, my heart starts racing. Because what if one day we don't get away? I've never been the kind of person to get scared easily. I've spent most of my life on the road, driving from state to state for work. The routine was always the same. A big breakfast, hours on the highway, some fast food in the middle of the trip, and, when exhaustion kicked in, a cheap roadside motel. That night was no different. After nearly 10 hours of driving, my eyes were heavy and my head was throbbing. The flickering neon sign of some random motel appeared on the side of the road like a blessing. I pulled in, walked into the lobby, and asked for a room for the night. The receptionist, a skinny guy who looked half asleep, handed me a key without much conversation. "Room 108, he mumbled, barely looking up from his phone. Crossing the parking lot was a relief. The cool night air was a sharp contrast to the stuffy heat inside my car. The motel was the typical roadside kind, doors lined up in a row, dim lighting, and a faint musty smell hanging in the air. I reached room 108, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and slid the keycard into the lock. Nothing. I tried again, pressing it in harder. The reader beeped, but the door wouldn't unlock. I sighed, already bracing myself for the annoying walk back to the front desk, but then I heard it. A sound from inside. A soft step. Then another. Someone was in there. I froze for a second, trying to make sense of it. Maybe they gave me the wrong key. Maybe a previous guest hadn't checked out yet. I knocked. "Hey, sorry, I think there's been a mistake. I was given this key." Silence. I waited a few seconds and knocked again. Nothing. But I knew I had heard footsteps. Pressing my ear against the door, I held my breath. That's when I heard something else. A slow, dragging creak, like someone moving a chair or opening a door. A knot tightened in my stomach. I stepped back and knocked harder. "Is someone in there?" More silence. By then, a cold chill was creeping up my spine. I glanced around. The parking lot was empty, the only sound coming from a buzzing street lamp nearby. I turned around and headed back to the front desk. The receptionist barely looked up as I explained the situation. "Are you sure?" he asked, frowning. "Room 108 is vacant." He typed something into his computer, his eyes narrowing as he double-checked. Yeah, no one's booked that room today. My stomach twisted. Then why did I hear someone inside? The receptionist didn't seem too convinced, but he grabbed a set of master keys and followed me back to room 108. The walk felt longer this time. The silence felt heavier, like the night itself was holding its breath. When we reached the door, it was slightly open. I knew I had left it shut. I exchanged a glance with the receptionist, who now looked a little less skeptical. He pushed the door open slowly, and as the wood creaked, I felt my heartbeat quicken. The dim yellow light revealed an unmade bed, the sheets tangled like someone had just climbed out of them. On the nightstand, there was a half-full glass of water, a dark stain at the bottom. But what made my breath catch in my throat was the bathroom door. It was closing, slowly, with a long, quiet creak, like someone on the other side was pushing it shut, deliberately. The receptionist took a hesitant step inside. "Hello? Anyone in here?" No answer. The door finally clicked shut, and a thick silence filled the room. The receptionist looked at me, then at the door, and forced a nervous laugh. Could be a draft or something. But I could see on his face that he didn't really believe that. He reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly, pushing the door open. The bathroom was empty. No open windows, no exits except for the one we had just come through. Just an old mirror above the sink and a shower curtain pulled to the side. The receptionist let out a breath, but I still felt something was wrong. It wasn't just the scene itself, it was the feeling, like the entire room was holding its breath. I wanted out. I wasn't even tired anymore, just uneasy, with a weight in my chest that wouldn't go away. "Is there another room available?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the bathroom door. The receptionist hesitated. "We're kind of full tonight." He glanced around, clearly uncomfortable now too. "But if you want, I can put you in 1 to 12. It's a little farther from the road, quieter." I nodded, not arguing. I grabbed my backpack and left before he could change his mind. But before shutting the door, I couldn't help but take one last look inside. The bathroom was still empty, but now the glass on the nightstand had tipped over. I walked quickly to room 112, my heart pounding. By now, I wasn't just uncomfortable, I was scared. It wasn't just the bathroom door closing on its own or the mess in a room that was supposed to be empty. It was the feeling that I hadn't been alone in there, like something had been watching me the entire time. When I finally stepped into my new room, I locked the door and let out a deep breath. The layout was identical to the last one, but for some reason, it felt safer. I lay down on the bed without even changing, just wanting to forget everything and sleep. But sleep didn't come. I lay there in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of cars on the highway and the hum of the air conditioner. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. The glass could have fallen from a vibration. The bathroom door could have closed because of a draft. But something still didn't add up. I had heard footsteps inside that room. And now that I thought about it, when I knocked on the door, the footsteps had stopped right near it. Like someone was standing on the other side, listening to my breathing. The thought made me sit up in bed, every hair on my body standing on end. That's when I heard something outside, faint, muffled, but loud enough to make me freeze. Footsteps, moving through the hallway. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was dark, lit only by the weak yellow glow of a street lamp outside. Nothing. Seconds passed, and then a low sound made my breath catch in my throat. A click. The sound of a lock being undone. But not mine. It was coming from the end of the hall, where room 1-8 was. I stood there, watching through the peephole, my chest rising and falling too fast. Then, something moved. The door to 108 creaked open, slow and deliberate. At first, just a crack, then a little more. But no one came out. It just stood open, like it was waiting for something. I waited for a full minute, not moving, not even blinking. And then, without warning, the door shut. By itself. Like someone had pulled it closed from the inside. I didn't want to stay there anymore. Every instinct in me screamed to leave that motel, get in my car, and drive without looking back. But at the same time, I knew that if I stepped into that hallway, I'd have to walk past room 108. And something told me that wasn't a good idea. So, I stayed. I didn't sleep. Every little noise kept me on edge. The wind rattling the window, the hum of the fridge, even the creak of the wooden floor beneath the carpet. But worst of all was the feeling that if I dared to look through the peephole again, I would see something I wasn't supposed to. When the sun finally started rising, I grabbed my things and left the room as fast as I could. The hallway was empty. Room 108 was still closed, like nothing had happened. But as I walked past it, a chill ran down my spine, an uncomfortable, heavy feeling, like something was still inside, watching. At the front desk, the night shift receptionist had been replaced by an older woman, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. I handed her the key and tried to act normal, but before leaving, I had to ask, "Room 108, is someone staying there now?" She looked up, frowning. 108? She typed something into the computer and shook her head. "No, that room hasn't been used for months." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "There was an incident. A guest died in that room last year. Ever since then, no one wants to stay there. Some of the staff say they hear noises, but, well, it's just their imagination, right?" I didn't answer. I just walked out, got into my car, and drove away without looking back. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know who or what was in that room with me. But to this day, every time I check into a roadside motel before I slide my key into the lock, I hold my breath, just to make sure I don't hear footsteps on the other side. I've always preferred driving at night. Less traffic, less noise, just me, the road, and a thermos full of coffee. But that night, I regretted it. This happened in 2018. I was driving home after visiting my sister in another state. The trip took about 6 hours, and I had already been on the road for 4 when my body started complaining. I needed to stretch my legs and grab a drink, so I pulled into one of those isolated rest stops by the highway. Small, empty, just a dirty restroom and a couple of vending machines. Not exactly inviting, but it would do. As soon as I stepped out of the car, I felt that heavy silence that only exists in places like that. The highway was about 50 yards away from where I parked, and past that, just woods. Not a single other soul in sight. I stretched, feeling my joints crack, and walked straight to the vending machine. As I debated between a soda and an energy drink, something caught my eye through the glass window of the abandoned diner next to the rest stop. A man was standing near the tree line. He was far away, almost just a shadow against the dimming sky, but I could tell he was tall and thin. He wore a long, dark coat and seemed to be looking directly at me, just standing there. I watched for a moment, waiting for him to move, some sign that he was just another tired traveler taking a break. But nothing. No movement, no gestures, no car nearby. Just him. My gut was telling me something was wrong, but I forced myself to ignore it. Maybe he was just smoking. Maybe he was waiting for someone. I grabbed my drink and walked back to my car, keeping him in the corner of my vision. He was still there, unmoving. When I opened my car door, I couldn't resist taking one last look. He hadn't shifted an inch. Same posture, same stare. And somehow, the silence around me felt even heavier now. My heart was already pounding as I got into the car and slammed the door shut. I turned the key in the ignition and stole one last glance at him, hoping, somehow, that he'd be gone. But he wasn't. He was still standing in the exact same spot, still facing me. And now, I was sure of one thing. He wasn't just some guy randomly looking around. He had been watching me from the moment I pulled in. I threw the car into reverse and got out of there fast, not even bothering to check my mirrors. I just wanted to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. But as I merged onto the highway and glanced at the rearview mirror, my stomach dropped. He was walking, not running, not hurrying, just walking, in my direction. One slow, deliberate step after another, like he had all the time in the world. I stepped on the gas. There was no way he could keep up with me. I was in a car, he was on foot. But something about the way he moved made me feel like I wasn't going fast enough. The speedometer climbed to 50 miles, then 60, then 70, and still, the feeling that he was following me wouldn't go away. Every few seconds, I checked the mirror, expecting to see him disappear into the distance, expecting him to be gone. But he wasn't. The fear turned into full-blown panic. I knew it was impossible for him to be keeping up, but the dread was overwhelming, like something was closing in on me, like he was getting closer in a way that didn't make sense. My hands were slick on the steering wheel, and every time I checked the mirror, I braced myself to see him stepping onto the road, still walking, still coming. That fear turned into panic. I knew it was impossible for him to be keeping up with me, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was suffocating, like something was still right behind me, just out of sight. My hands were slick on the steering wheel, and every time I checked the mirror, I expected to see him stepping onto the road, still walking, still coming. That's when I saw headlights approaching from the opposite direction. A truck. I clung to that sight like a lifeline. As soon as it passed me, I honked my horn, flashed my lights, anything to get the driver's attention. The truck slowed down and pulled over. Without thinking, I did the same. When I rolled down my window, my voice was shaky. There's a guy following me. He was at the rest stop, but there's no car. He's just walking, but I didn't even know how to explain it. The trucker stared at me for a second, then turned his head to look down the highway. I followed his gaze. Nothing. Just empty road, fading into darkness. That stretch of highway had barely any streetlights, and the rest stop was long gone from my mirror. If he was still back there, I couldn't see him anymore. But that feeling, that weight on my chest, hadn't gone away. It still felt like something was out there, watching, waiting. The trucker let out a slow breath and said, "If I were you, I wouldn't stop again until you get to town." He wished me a safe trip and pulled back onto the road. I did the same, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, refusing to check the mirror again. I got home that night without looking back. But to this day, whenever I drive alone at night and see someone walking by the side of the road, a chill runs down my spine, and just in case, I never stop.